Hi, I'm Pastor David with Declaration Church, and there are a lot of times that when I talk to people about God and about Jesus, that the question of suffering and difficulty comes up, and they begin to ask questions about why suffering and struggle and trials are even, why they even exist if God is good. And it's a very difficult question to answer, and I certainly don't have all of the answers for that. I don't have necessarily an answer that's going to be sufficient for every struggle and every trial that you may be facing. But I was reading in Daniel chapter 3, and I found something there that I think is really it's one possible answer to the question of why there is suffering and why we go through trials and why we go through struggles if God is loving. And so I know that when I've gone through some difficult times in my life, as I look back, I see some things differently than I did at the time that I was actually in the midst of the struggle. And maybe you can say the same thing. But as I was reading through Daniel, I came across this story that's actually very familiar if you've been in Sunday school or you've attended church at any time, if you are consistently a part of a church for a long period of time, you've probably come across the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel chapter 3. It's a very, very popular story, especially with kids, because it's exciting and it covers a lot of great stuff. It's about three guys who end up being thrown into a burning fiery furnace, as it's described, in order to be executed for a decision that they make. And that decision is to remain faithful to God, to live their life according to what they know to be true. And because they do that, they are thrown into a fire to burn to death. That's the understanding of what's taking place here. That's the stage that's been set. As we look at this passage in Daniel chapter 3, it's just one verse, in verse 25. So what goes on there, they decide, hey, we're not going to worship any other gods. They've made that decision. The king of Babylon sets up an image, sets up an idol, a huge monument, possibly to himself. No one really knows. It doesn't describe the image, just says it's really tall and it's made out of gold. And he says, hey, when you hear the music, you got to bow down and worship. And they refuse to do that. They maintain their integrity. They're like, no, we're going to remain faithful to our God. We're going to continue to live consistently the way that God has told us to live. We're going to be true to ourselves. We're going to be true to our God. We're going to be faithful. And so they stand for God. And there are people, they have enemies just like you and I do. They have enemies and they say, hey, king, there are these guys that they're not following what you tell them to do. They're not obeying. When you say, you hear the music, you bow down and worship this image I've set up, they don't. And the king gets upset, but he says, you know what? These are trusted officials in my kingdom. These guys are a part of my leadership team here in the province of Babylon. I don't want to just throw them into the fire. So I'm going to bring them in. I'm going to talk with them. I'm going to give them an opportunity because maybe they don't really understand the situation. And so he explains the situation very clearly and says, hey, if you don't bow down and worship, I'm going to throw you into this furnace. And so, when you hear the music, go ahead and bow down and we're good. And they say, you know what? No. We won't do that. Our God can do this. He can save us. But even if he doesn't, he's still God, and we're not going to bow down and worship your image. And he gets so upset that he heats the furnace 7 times hotter, it says, than they normally would keep it. So apparently this is a normal way to execute people in Babylon. And yet they're going to be subject to this. And he's like, you know what? Even the normal furnace is not enough for these guys. We need to make it even worse. So he heats it up 7 times. They're thrown into the fiery furnace, and even the guys who throw them into the furnace die because of exposure to the heat. And then he looks into the furnace, and he says, hey, wait a minute, didn't we throw 3 people into the furnace, guys? He's talking to his officials that are with him. They're like, absolutely. And that's where we are when we read this verse. It says, he answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods. He looks into the furnace, and instead of seeing just 3 guys that he threw in there, there are 4. And so what I get out of this is that there are some times in our lives that when we're faithful to God, we're living our lives the way he's told us to live them. We're being true to ourselves. We're reflecting him in a very positive way. We're reflecting him in the way that nobody else can in the world. And we're being faithful to him. We're being faithful to what he's called us to do. Our purpose is being fulfilled. And when we're doing that, negative things happen. We begin to suffer, sometimes even because of that. And we can begin to question, what in the world is going on? Why is this happening? It's a very common question. And it's a valid one. It's valid to feel that way. And what I come to understand through this passage is that there are times where other people, just because we're being faithful, just because we are doing what God has called us to do, being who God has called us to be, that they still won't see God active in our lives. They still won't see him, even though he's right there in front of their faces, until struggle comes, until the trial comes, until the difficulty hits. And when that happens, and we remain faithful even in the midst of the trial, even in the midst of the struggle and the difficulty, that's when they're able to see God. That's when they're able to see his hand moving in our lives, working alongside of us, and taking care of us when they couldn't see him before. So today, if you're going through a difficult time, I hope that this is an encouragement to you that maybe just because you're being faithful to God through the struggle, someone else will be able to see him when they never have before. And if this is encouraging to you, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. Like the video, subscribe to the channel so that you can continue to see these when they come out, and they can continue to encourage you, because that's my heart with this, is that they encourage you not only to continue walking faithfully with God, but to draw closer to him and to really come to a better understanding of who you are. Hopefully, this has been an encouragement to you. If it has, and you've been enjoying these videos, go ahead and share them with friends as well so that they too can be encouraged. As always, I'm Pastor David, and I'm out.